Welcome back. We just talked about kind of the basics of NSX segmentation, and now we're going to go into the distributed firewall specifically. We're going to break this up. There's a lot of stuff going on here. We're going to break this up into a couple of videos, just so you have a heads up. There's going to be a break coming up. We're going to talk about the different kind of firewalls, what we're doing with our distributed firewall, how we're going to configure policies and rules and block malicious IP addresses and all kinds of stuff, right? There's a lot of stuff going on here. So what are we doing with NSX firewalls? Well, we've got two different types of firewalls in NSX. We have our gateway firewalls, which are perimeter devices that, well, they work just like pretty much any other perimeter firewall. And then we've got our distributed firewall, which works a lot like that, only it's attached to the virtual NIC of every virtual machine. The distributed firewall is really, really a cool feature of NSX, right? Being able to control traffic flow in and out of a virtual NIC right at the NIC is pretty fantastic. So we've got a couple of different types of firewalls, and we will use them accordingly, right? No one firewall can do everything. We need to think about that, right? The gateway firewall is there to provide some perimeter filtering, and then the distributed firewall is really there to help us protect virtual machines from one another, is really what that boils down to. So the distributed firewall offers layer 2 Ethernet rules, offers layer 3-4 stateless firewall rules, offers layer 7 rules, gives us an identity capability so we can actually use Active Directory identity or login identity as maybe the source of a firewall rule to protect different applications and network endpoints from different users. We can do FQDN filtering. We have a malicious IP block. Now in NSX4, we can do time-based policies. In other words, this is a really, really full-featured firewall. Now, as we talk about the distributed firewall, or really any of our security management, we need to talk about policies, right? Policies are groupings of rules, right? And that's how we're gonna think about organizing most of our firewall rules or our other security rules as we get into other security tools later on. We're going to build these policies, and these policies will be for maybe one application or one environment or whatever it might be. The policy is my organizing structure. Inside that policy, I will build my rules. And the rules are going to be made up of all the different things rules are made of, right? My source and destination for what traffic I want to match. Well, most of the time in NSX, we're going to use groups for those sources and destinations. And groups can be statically or dynamically generated. We'll talk about that a little later. But we can populate them different ways depending on what our specific needs are, what we're trying to actually accomplish. So that's my source and destination. Then we've got our ports and protocols. With the ports and protocols, those are typically handled by an object called a service in NSX, right? A service is simply an object-based abstraction of protocol, TCP, UDP, ICMP, whatever, and a port or ports or a range of ports or a set of ports or whatever it might be. So instead of having to constantly remember in my firewall rules that to allow SSH, I need to remember to allow TCP port 20, destination port 22 to my SSH server, I need to just plug in the SSH service. It makes my rules a little bit readable, a little bit more readable, but it does mean that I've got a little bit of an abstraction that I've got to think about there as well. So we've got our service, and then we might even have a context profile. A context profile allows us to bring in more, well, just like it says, context to the match. Maybe that's a layer 7 app ID. Maybe that's an FQDN for FQDN filtering. Whatever it might be here, now we have this additional context filter that we can use as we're matching our traffic. So those are the things that we're looking at in a distributed firewall policy, and in turn in a distributed firewall rule. Now, as we go in and look, we're going to start spending our time not in the networking tab of NSX now, but in the security tab. And so we go into the security tab, and if we look up at the top, we've got our overview, right? Our security overview. And if we go to the configuration tab there, well, look at that. We have a nice list, a nice view of how many things I have configured. Now we scroll down for that. We might get a couple of graphs showing some basic configuration options, but this gives me an overview of what I have for security in my infrastructure right now. And most of that, or at least right now, we're talking about the distributed firewall. That's what this lesson is all about. So, we're thinking about that. Before we go and start looking, we're going to see that we manage the distributed firewall and organize our rules in categories. We've got a bunch of different categories to think about. Listed here are those categories: Ethernet, emergency, infrastructure, environment, and application. And these are going to actually be visualized in the UI from left to right. We'll see that in a minute. But this gives us an idea of visualizing them top down like this, the processing order. Right? Because we process firewall rules, we talk about processing from the top down, right? From the first rule to the last rule until we find a match. Well, we process our rules inside our categories that way, and we process our categories top down, or from the first category to the last. The first category we process is going to be the Ethernet rules. The Ethernet rules, this is where my layer 2 policy comes in if I have a need for such a thing. Once we go from there, we go to the Ethernet category. Not the Ethernet. We started with Ethernet. We're not looping around. We go to the emergency category. The emergency category is where I'm going to put my rules for quarantining. So I'll actually, instead of creating things in an emergency, I'll have policies and rules pre-staged so that I can help automate the response to different security incidents. One example we love to use is having some firewall rules in the emergency category that will block access to a malware-infected virtual machine. And, we're doing that by setting up a malware-infected group. All right, going back to what we were just looking at, the groups are my sources and destinations. Setting up a malware-infected group, and then when my malware tools detect some kind of malware in a virtual machine, they can apply a tag to that virtual machine, which in turn introduces membership into the malware-infected group, which in turn applies the security policies in the emergency category to that virtual machine, right? We're basically, again, automating that response by pre-staging those rules in the emergency category here. Now, I can also use the emergency category for, say, zero-day type situations where I have some kind of thing rolling through my network that I can block with a single port and protocol, and I can stop the spread. I could just run into the emergency category and have that rule built and applied, and at that point, all the distributed firewalls could stop the spread of whatever it is. So we've got this emergency category that we can use for those things. Once we move into the infrastructure category, we're going to start thinking about the most commonly hit rules in our environment, because these are going to be our shared services rules. DNS, NTP, backup, Active Directory, syslog, things like that, right? All of these different shared services we use in our environments every day. Well, I want those rules processed early on because, well, that's good for performance, right? Because everything is using these rules. So let's match them first. Once we process the infrastructure rules, we will then move to the environment category. The environment category is where we're going to build our rules that say, well, prod cannot talk to the dev environment, dev cannot talk to the test environment, and so on and so forth. And then finally, we'll get into the application category, where I'm going to build my policies for my individual applications and actually define out my micro-segmentation. From there, we have our default policy that's going to allow all or deny all. Out of the box, it's going to allow all. So when you deploy NSX, you deploy the distributed firewall, the default rule says to allow all traffic. I'm probably on a journey to get to denying all of my traffic. Now, as we look at our policies, as we think about our policies, and here's where we start to see those categories in the UI. As we go to my distributed firewall management, we see those categories spread out in a little left to right arrow sequence. We can build policies. We need to build policies. I can't build a rule unless I have at least one policy. And the policy is going to define the generalized order of processing inside the category. And it's going to house my rules, and it's going to define things like, is this a stateful or stateless set of firewall rules? So, I can look at that inside the policy. I'm going to have all my rules. I'm going to process top down inside the policy. So I can expand out. If I'm looking at my distributed firewall here, I can expand out all of my policies, and I can actually see the precise firewall ordering, because we're going to process policy by policy top down, and inside that policy, we're going to process rule by rule top down. So we can see what's going on there. Now, inside my policy, I have a field called applied to. Inside my rules, I also have a field called applied to. Chances are we're going to leave the applied to in the policy just to DFW, just to the distributed firewall, so that I can be much more granular with each individual rule. However, I don't have to. I can set an applied to value for the policy, and that's going to define where the rules in that policy are going to be applied. In other words, to which virtual machines will those policies be applied. All right? We're going to define those virtual machines by way of one or more groups. Now, as I'm working with my policy, as I'm managing my policy, I have a settings that I can define on my policy, and I can hit that little gear icon and look at my policy settings. And this is where I can toggle whether or not the policy is stateful, for example. This is where I can toggle whether or not I want to enforce TCP strict behavior. In other words, before I start really allowing flows or packets in a flow, do I have to see the full three-way TCP handshake? Chances are I want to leave this on. We also have an operational option in here, and that's locked, right? That's locking the policy. So, this is useful. NSX is a multi-user system. If I want to prevent another user from modifying this policy or rules in this policy while I'm working on it, well, I can go ahead and lock the policy, make my changes, publish my changes, and then when I'm done, I can unlock the policy, right? So this can be unlocked. If I forget to unlock it, somebody else can unlock it. But this is great for multi-user environments where you have many NSX administrators, right? We don't want to have somebody else coming in and changing something that I'm already working on. Now, when I think about time-based firewalling, right, enabling rules on a schedule, that's also a policy option. So I'm going to build time-based policies, and then all of the rules in that policy will enable and disable on whatever schedule I define, whatever time window I'm looking at here. So I get to choose, things like, is this time window going to be, is it going to be a one-time thing? Is it going to be a repeatable thing? When is the window going to open? When is it going to close? Do I need to recur on multiple days, or is it just one day a week? Whatever it is. So I've got a number of options here that I can define for my time windows that I can use for my different firewall policies if I need this capability. So we're going to take a break here. Let's stand back for just a minute and think about security, right? We're managing security with policies, and policies are going to be put into categories. And policies, we've got a certain number of configuration toggles that we can look at to control all of the rules in the policy. Let's come back in a couple of minutes, and we'll start talking about the rules in those policies. We'll see you there.